Welcome to this recording of TIMCA's first webinar in its education series. Firstly, let me introduce our two guests, Mclaughlin and Sipho Mpisane. Ian is one of South Africa's leading educationalists. He has over 35 years of experience in leading, building and exploring learning within educational institutions in South Africa. A former headmaster of St. Stithians College, he has also worked for more than 2 decades on cognitive development interventions in a number of subjects with Professor Michael Scher, Professor of Applied Psychology at King's College London University. Sipho is currently the Program Manager for our implementation of Thinking Maths and Teacher Development. He has a master's degree in education from the University of Witwatersrand in Educational Leadership, Management and Policy Studies. His areas of interest include cognitive acceleration through maths and instructional leadership in 21st century education. Unfortunately, you have missed some of this discussion around the cognitive acceleration program at Kwena Malapo, and we did indicate, and you may be able to see from the slides in the article on our website, that there has been a 9% improvement in the results of the children that have been working with the Let's Think Maths program at Kwena Malapo over the past number of years. But today, we are going to be tackling the perturbing issue raised by studies in the UK, which show that man's capacity to think critically is declining. So we've called this the missing think, and we'll join the discussion as our guests are introducing 4 approaches to resolving this developing trend. We hope that you enjoy the webinar. Thank you for joining us.
First quadrant, that's the South African curriculum framework. It was only published, I think, late last year or maybe the year before that. Been around for about a year, but it's a really powerful one, and Sipho and I have used it a lot. So procedural fluency is in the middle there. It's really important. You need to spend a great deal of time on procedural fluency, but I think what's happened is most secondary school maths and science in particular, it's 90% of what you do, or maybe even 95% of what you do. And that's not really helping accelerate the development of the children. It might be allowing them to do well in standardized tests, where they test on the procedures, but it doesn't accelerate their development. Okay? So for me, the really big one there is productive disposition, because we'll get to that when we go down to those quadrants below. But you're really going to struggle with procedural fluency, conceptual understanding, everything else if you don't have an engaged child. So productive disposition is a very important part of a curriculum framework. So once we've ticked that procedural fluency is critical, we then need to look at the conceptual understanding. So that doesn't get too much attention around the world. The people that I've worked with in the UK and the USA, they tend to sort of say that's not really paid much attention in the actual classroom process. They see the procedural fluency dominating entirely. And then the strategic competence, which you talked about just now from New York. Sorry, I've forgotten your name and I can't see it. Laura. The strategic competence, you require metacognitive development. You need to enhance and start learning how to use your ability to reason about your own reasoning. I mean, that's what planning is. And when you get to implementation and having to bounce new ideas. So strategic competence needs to be a part of the curriculum framework. And then the last one, which is probably the most difficult one, it's the one that you can measure someone's capacity for adapting their reasoning. So that's that graph that I showed you with the cognitive development. So we all, as human beings, we slowly but surely develop a more and more effective brain for reasoning. So things like your ability to attend or be attentive, your long-term memory, your working memory, your processing speed, all those things develop as you grow up. And so you have to be aware of where a child's is in terms of their adaptive reasoning capacity so that you can listen to them correctly when they're doing problem solving or procedures. What that tells me is that you've got to have a balanced diet. I do think, and Sipho and I found we were in a system that had coverage and tests and exams and all that. We used to put about a half the week into procedural fluency, and the other half of the week we put into the other areas. So we balanced it out as much as we could. Then bottom left-hand corner is probably the most important first step. It's the productive disposition. So a psychologist called Bandura, he has self-efficacy processes, which and I've tried them for years, and I've been spending quite a long time working on them recently. How do you take a child? Because what happens to a lot of children in maths and science, say at secondary school, they learn how to be helpless. Seligman calls it learned helplessness. So they just give up. They actually learned that they can't do this, and they give up. And so Bandura, his processes, they're absolutely brilliant. Is how do you take someone who's in a state of learned helplessness, and how do you take them to a space where they can start self-regulating? Now, it's a very interesting process. It takes time, but it really works. So very quickly, I'll give you the 3 blocks, but there are many more. The first one is you've got to listen to the child, because you're not allowed to talk about anything the child doesn't bring up. So you have to listen to the child's narrative, how they feel, what they think, what they want to talk about in whatever area you want to talk about, whatever it is. Then after listening to the child for long enough, there's a lot of hope for you, Colin. Then you take an example from the child's thinking, and you then start going into the second phase, which is reciprocal determinism. So you might say to the child, I said to an 11-year-old girl 2 weeks ago, okay, Katie, are you saying to me that this is how I will do it? And then I try to repeat what she said, and I try to demonstrate what she told me. And so she's actually observing me trying to role play her to herself. And in the process, I then change it a bit, and I start saying, well, look, maybe I do this. If I was trying to do what you just told me, maybe I could try and do this. What do you think, Katie? And so we start role-playing and observing each other. So remember, it's critical. Bandura will tell you it has to come from the child. You're not allowed to bring up whatever it is. Then you go into the stage of role-playing and role modeling that interplays between yourself and the child. And then once they get that, they start getting excited. They literally, this little 11-year-old, she was pumping once I'd gone through those 2 stages with her. And then I could start getting her to start the self-regulation, where I can start saying, well, how are you feeling now, Katie? How are you actually feeling about what you're doing? And she was excited and feeling good. And I said, well, remember that, because you're feeling, that's your metacognition. You're actually starting to feel what it feels like to think for yourself. And it's a wonderful thing. So there's a lot more to Bandura than I've read there, but there are those 3 big stages, and you can't hurry them. The most important one is the first one, listening for the child, and you're listening for something that you can use in the next 2 stages. And then the final one, maybe it's a bit heavy, but I use Dimitri, Andreas Dimitri. He's got an architecture of the mind. And there are these 4 processes. You have the domains of reasoning, then you get the representations, then you get the integration of these representations at different levels, and finally you get to what he calls the cognizance, which is the awareness and the self-monitoring and the self-evaluating, basically the self-regulation. So you can see metacognition in the pedagogy, you can see the productive disposition in the curriculum framework, you can see the self-regulation in Magdira's work, and you can see the cognizance in Dimitriou's work. They're all related. The target is to think for yourself and to be aware of your own thinking. As soon as you can get there, all the champagne corks should pop.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ian. I mean, that's a good place, I think, for us to start to just ask maybe Sipho for some final sort of comments on your side, and then we're going to be taking questions. We have got about 13 minutes left of the sort of formal hour. There are a few questions that have come through, and I'd like to encourage those of you to put your questions on the chat group. That will be easier for us, and because from that point of view, just to get the questions out there. But Sipho, any thoughts from you sort of to finish off the formal section of the presentation?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because I have more questions than thought, really.
Okay.
Which I think is fine. I think, that's the nature of this discussion. I don't think there's really one solution, but I'm challenged by kind of this framework that's been presented. And if we were to assume that this is kind of the roadmap or the plan on how we develop thinking, not just in children, but how we develop thinking from a young age into adulthood, the big question that comes to mind for me is, whose responsibility is it? Whose shoulders does it fall on, and how practically do we see it's rolling out? If this is a framework that we agree is solid and is founded on sound theory, and we agree on all these elements, where to from then? The how element pops up for me.
Okay. So I mean, on the slide, I'm going to leave the slide up. I think if you're happy for me to leave the slide up, gentlemen, I think it's just quite a useful slide to talk to. And the key thing there that you mentioned as well is that this is a plan to monitor each child, or monitor every child. Can you expand on that a bit for us?
Yeah, so the recent years, I've been involved in quite a few exciting, so I was being listening somewhere. I was involved with an organization where we tried to vastly reduce the number of hours that specialist teachers spent with children. So we tried to increase, so the procedural learning, the procedural fluency, I think you can have much larger classes and you can use a better style of direct instruction, and you can use all those skills that we're pretty good at anyway. But then you need to carve out other time, which is completely different. Some of it where there's no teacher present, and some where there's only one tutor with maybe one child, or maybe a tutor with two children. So you need to have a very different type of schooling. I'm not sure what the answer is. I've tried quite a few varieties. Sipho and I have tried some as well in the last few years. But I think it's time for schooling to really reorganize itself, use what we understand about learning. So that map there with those 4 quadrants, how do we best use that in school now? And we've got a real opportunity with this virus because it's gone online, and online is not working. What I'm hearing from quite a few schools, the top 25% are doing even better than they've ever done before. And then the middle lot, no one's really sure what's happening to them. And then the bottom third or so, and it changes from school to school, they've just about disappeared, and they don't seem to be making any progress at all. They've just they've gone missing, literally, some of them. And they keep trying to go missing because online learning is just not working. So I think there's so much complexity, but I do think there's a huge opportunity now, because if we understand that you can accelerate and have much happier children, so there's a whole lot of...
It's muted.
Sorry. Yeah.
So, Jerome, you wanted to ask a question? No. Maybe I can ask if there is anybody who would like to ask a question. If you could put your camera on and then unmute yourself, I can then see you, because I think there may be a couple of questions that want to come through. There's nothing coming through on the chat. I see, Alan, you indicated the same thing in the UK, and this is certainly a trend. I mean, Laura mentioned it as well, a trend that is coming through from a number of different areas and literature. So what is your experience in the UK, Alan? Perhaps you can help us with that.
In terms of the online learning?
Yes.
It was the educational haves benefited from it and taught themselves, and the have-nots didn't engage and were lost. Or they missed out on the social side. My nephew engaged with his work, but missed out on the social side, and he's 13, and I do worry about him, how we'll regain that time that he's missed. So it'll be 6 months. But it was quite clear, the statistics from the good schools, those type of children, they engaged, they did their activities, but the rest of them, just 6 months off. Very, very sad.
So if we, I mean, one of the questions, I think, Laura, you may want to comment on something from the US there. I think you've come online.
I have so much to content. It's such a different approach from the United States. I think we use polio as our model for problem solving very much in mathematics, and I did certainly, which actually consolidates a lot of what you're talking about. But it's just, I don't even know where to begin. I personally, I think I embed much of what you've talked about in the work that I've done. But I think that the problem in the United States, again, is we don't give time. You know, we do a mile, you know, an inch high, a mile wide kind of thing, and we do the mile wide, and we never do anything in depth. So everything is a little itty bitty bit, and we never learn anything because we never spend any time. We never allow for the creativity, you know, with the students, and so it's very difficult. I mean, I love your idea of posing that one question that will be good for everybody, and kids can come up with different answers and stuff. I know my daughter teaches elementary school, and she does that kind of thing because she builds a curriculum which is very different than sort of the standard one that they're asked to do to just meet the standards. But in any case, it's a big problem, you know, that we don't allow. You know, I know of kids that you have to do it this way, and if you dare to solve a problem a different way, the teacher marks it wrong because that's not the way she told you to do it. She doesn't even accept that you might have done a procedure differently, and it may be because she doesn't know how to do it differently, because she's not good in math and she can only do things one way. You know, that's a big problem, that our teachers are not even able enough to teach things so that they can only do something one way and are not open to the children doing things a different way. Our teachers are not educated well enough is a big problem. But there's 100 million things that are wrong. So anyway, I mean, I think, for example, if you started with a little kid, and you said you put 2 fingers up and 2 blocks and 2 of this and 2 of, and many different ways of saying 2. And you say to them, well, you know, you can draw 2, you know, give me 2 blocks, or you can draw 2 things, or, you know, you can shoot, you know, you can make 2 noises. And there's so many ways of saying two that, I need to get some way that I can represent two, that it'll always mean the same thing, even though there's all these different things. So is there one way that I can say two, and it'll always be two no matter what, whether it's 2 blocks or 2 cans? And so, oh yeah, well, I'm going to show you a way, and we're going to call these things numerals, and numerals will be able to use these numerals to represent these quantities, so that if I write this numeral, always mean 2 blocks, 2 of this, and so that you begin to teach, what how numbers represent quantities, okay? And so that these are symbols. You're introducing symbols at an early age, so that by the time you get to X, Y, and Z, just another symbol. It's not this, oh my God, what's an X? What's a,
Right.
and they get dizzy when they start to see this. So you're already introducing the notion of symbols and a representation of a quantity, so that by the time we get to algebra, it's a non-starter, and it's not going to fall, so it's just going to be another way of representing numbers. It's just another way of doing arithmetic, and it's not a big deal. And so you learn another procedure.
Something that I've ended up doing quite a lot is I've done these thinking math lessons for a lot of young adults or even older adults in part of the teacher training side of things. And quite often I've had people sort of break down in tears as they've realized that they really can think mathematically. Because I've had the odd person in these classrooms, they're in there because they're pretty experienced teachers, but they're not maths teachers. And through the process of a thinking maths lesson, which allows everybody in, and you all can think for yourself. And if you're able to think at a high level, boy, you go, and you do it really well. And so I've literally had cases, and Sipho, you might have seen some with me, where people were emotionally overwhelmed by actually realizing how they can think for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in something like mathematics, because they've long time been convinced they can't do that. Well, Alan's just made a point on the screen there, which is really, Sipho and I have seen this all the time. You get such a mix of ideas from the children. Things that, as a teacher, Sipho, I keep on saying it, and Sipho's seen it now very often. You get children saying things that you've never heard of in your life. So I've spent my life working on, say, quadratic equations or whatever. And then you have a child comes in from the left-hand side with something that you have never thought of to do with quadratic equations. And I get so excited I can't contain myself, but so do the children around that, because they also have never seen it before, and it's coming from one of them. It's not coming from the teacher. So there is that mix of levels and ideas that is so exciting to see.
Yeah, and I think Ellen kind of describes it beautifully, and I think it's in response to Melusi's question on the benefits of mixing a class, because we know sometimes classes get streamed according to ability. What that ability is a question mark. Usually it's test scores, right? The kids that do well in tests or in their marks, they get put in one classroom, and the ones that seem to be struggling, they put in one. And I'm of the same school of thought that Ellen describes, that there's more benefit to mixing a classroom, mainly because of the social construction, the powerful social construction that can happen when learners speak to their peers. I think often, we've all had that teacher who we just could never understand. They were really brilliant in the subject that they taught, but they were speaking a language that was just far ahead of us, and our conclusion was that we're stupid, or we just don't get the subject. But it's because the language was just too far removed from what we could understand. So that's the power of the social construction, is that when learners begin to speak to their peers, they speak in a language that is easily decoded because they are closer to where they are cognitively. So that's the benefit of mixing a class. And often the reasons why classes are streamed, most schools argue that, you can give the smart learners more challenging work, and you can give the ones that are struggling more remedial work and more remedial attention. But that rarely ever is the reality, because the teacher themselves does not have necessarily the skill to deal with a specific group. And I think it's much more valuable to develop the skill of facilitating learning with a mixed bunch of kids who can learn and benefit from each other's ideas and not just from your own teaching as a teacher.
Okay. Malusi, maybe I can ask you to come in here if you're still on the line with us. Does that answer your question? I think there was an aspect of your question around online learning as well, and the disappearance of certain of the sort of the poorer socioeconomic groups.
Yeah, so the latter part of the question has been answered. What I'm interested in is when Ian spoke of the disappearance of where some kids go missing, which are mostly in the bottom half of the cognitive levels. The question was, does it then mean they rely more on the social aspect of learning more than the ones that are in the top half or top quarter of the cognitive levels?
Sure. Can I talk?
Yeah.
That's a fascinating question. So I've got a sort of vague hope, because what's happening in South Africa, so my understanding of Mclaughlin and the kids there really, or mostly in poverty, they're getting no schooling at all. They're not getting any access to anything. They're just at home. They haven't got their books. They're not seeing their teachers. They're on their own. There's a possibility they'll do even better, some of them, because they'll go and interact together, and even if they're playing together, they might develop themselves better than, because what Sipho and I have seen in a South African school setting is there's this, so Laura talked about it, this coverage, and actually it's hugely damaging. So the kids just get hit by this mind-blowing quantity of stuff that they don't get much out of. So it's a sad thing, but some children might benefit from no school. And so the school of life, provided they're not in depression or in hunger or all those horrible things, if they start playing together and coming up with new activities for themselves and their friends, even if they are trying to start a small business or whatever they're doing, it'll be a lot better for them than a lot of the schooling. That's my hope, Malusi, because what we see at Mclaughlin, Sipho, you know much more than I do at the moment, those kids are getting no schooling, nothing, zero. Sipho, what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, but what I do know is we've seen, especially in the poorer communities, we've seen that the learners that are able to be successful, especially the later years of their high schooling, is learners who have been able to group themselves and work in groups outside of the formal schooling system. Learners who are able to go through past papers, they find one person who is knowledgeable in a certain subject or in a certain area within a certain subject, and they group themselves and do afternoon, study sessions. There's lots of stories that we hear of how, learners in these circumstances have been able to be successful and go on to really reach, top results within matric. So I agree with you that in this kind of bottom sector, in inverted commas, in our public school system, there's a huge benefit to the social element of schooling. But that social element has to be kind of clarified, because because there's certain ingredients needed, right? You need somebody who's knowledgeable. It's not, we can't just be kind of at the same level. You know, that's not the ZPD that Ellen is referring to. If we're all struggling and there's no one that is slightly above, they don't have to be, you know, an expert. They don't have to be way above, but you need somebody that is slightly more knowledgeable than the rest. And that ingredient is necessary for the success of the group.
A question here, Sipho and Ian, from Jerome, talking about, and I think this is quite relevant, particularly in an environment where we have multiple languages, or you're not perhaps studying in your first language. They're saying, why not require kids to look up words they don't understand, because every subject is mostly word related. So just in your experience, how does that impact students? I hope.
So Quentin Malapa, what was amazing for me, so in a thinking maths lesson, good question up front, well prepared in discussion. The discussion that was with me involved was always in English. With Sipho, he would quite often do pieces in different languages. But so say in the lessons that I did, so I had to do the first question in English, but I'd make sure that I had enough from the classroom to understand that my question was going to float. Then when went into social construction, different groups would be talking different languages. So sometimes you'd get people who got together just because they could all speak the same language. I couldn't speak it. And in the last stage of the lesson, and Sipho saw this often with me, a child would come up and they'd want to explain their reasoning. They're excited because they've now got something they want to say. They'd come up and they'd speak in their mother tongue. And I found often I could understand them, even though I couldn't understand a word of the language they were talking, because I knew what the maths question was. We'd have this communication, very deep learning going on where I couldn't understand their language and they probably struggled with mine. But at the same time, because of the social construction, because the 3 or 4 children had such a huge, good discussion. So Sipho, what I would notice with you, Sipho, you'd switch between languages often, and often there was no English. So I'd be sitting in there following the lesson, but seldom was anyone talking English if Sipho was talking, and most of the children were talking whatever language Sipho was using at the time.
Yeah, I think the emphasis, it's an interesting question, and we are unique in some of the South African schools in that you have a classroom where there's 5 different languages. Even though the medium of instruction is English, the proficiency is usually not that great, and so it helps to get everybody confident in sharing their ideas in their own language. But at the same time, you want to develop the language that they need to attain in order to express these ideas. So you're kind of doing both. You're giving them the confidence to express themselves in their own language, but it gives you an opportunity as well to develop, the language of medium, or the medium of instruction, as it were. So the language question is an interesting one, because I think often it's how we exclude certain groups from accessing knowledge, right? So equity is thrown out the door because of the insensitivity to language. And if the purpose is learning, language should not be a barrier. You should be able to explain or find ways of explaining something at a level where each learner is, right? But at the same time, be aware that there's a place where you need to get them to, and do your best to develop them along that path as well.
The concept that you present of children who are able to think perfectly, how does that sort of tie in? Because it seems as if you give them the opportunity, you give them that opportunity to express themselves, to actually learn. They have that, they can do that. It's not that somebody should be put into a box and say, you come from a particular socioeconomic group, you come from a particular place, you're going to be like that.
Yeah, I mean, Laura's thoughts really resonate with what we do, and our way of thinking when it comes to how we approach learning and how we approach education. The social and emotional aspect of learning cannot be understated. You have to believe in kids. You have to believe that they think perfectly. You have to be aware of their potential. You've got to be able to see them as just a bowl of potential, because I think a lot of our system is designed in a way that we write off a huge section of our population because of the standardizational nature of our education system. It's all about test scores and and standardized tests, and we box children into particular thinking abilities using the wrong measurements. But if we begin to kind of realize and appreciate how every child thinks perfectly just at the level at which they are, then it's easy for us to seek out what that level is, and to dedicate our time, our expertise, and our knowledge into how do we improve them from where they are. And a lot of that has to do with creating the social and emotional environment that motivates them to do so.
Needs to be a balance between, let's say, the procedural fluency in any discipline, together with the conceptual understanding and social and emotional well-being, etc. What I would do is I would have very low stakes testing for the procedural fluency. I mean, at the moment it's too high stakes. Everyone sees the results. All those results go home, get discussed over the family dinner table and so on. So I think there's too much high stakes testing. And so we need to have lots of procedural fluency work, probably about a 50% balance if you're doing secondary school mathematics, let's say.
We can testing, and we should build portfolio.
Yes. So there should be lots and lots of portfolio. But I just want to caution against going too far and dropping the necessary factual and procedural knowledge, because it's not all conceptual.
This sets us up, I think, very nicely for where we would like to go with the next webinar in about a month's time. We were discussing this, and just in terms of what do we think is good education now in this situation in which we're in. I think it builds on to what we've been discussing this time, and will be a good topic for us to go into in a month's time. We'll be having a webinar on the last Monday of every month now in this education series, and we'll send out those details. Please, if you would like to communicate with us, please, if you can put your questions on the website in the webinar section, or you can email us at admin@timca.org, and Charlene will put that email address up now if you want to copy that. That's admin@timca.org. Thanks, Charlene, for that. And just some final words, if I can, in the last 2 minutes, just final words from Ian and from Sipho, just to end off the evening for us. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
I think that there's a lot to be done in this space. There's a lot of strands that need to be pulled together. I think to touch on Ian's last point, that the focus needs to be a balanced one. It can't be skewed just towards procedure and factual understanding, but that needs to be pulled together in a balanced fashion with how do we grow the conceptual understanding of everything that we're doing. And it's a both and situation and not a either or. And that needs to be embedded in every aspect of education, whatever subjects it is that we're teaching, and that's how we're going to develop this nation into thinkers.
Thank you very much, Sipho. Ian, the final word from you.
For me, what we said right at the beginning, how do we get the probably millions of children on the globe who are in a state of learned helplessness because of what's been going on in their lives? And how do we get them, many, many more of them, to a state of self-regulation where there's a whole lot more well-being? So I think when you are in a state of learned helplessness, it's sort of related to anxiety and depression. It doesn't feel good at all. And that it shouldn't be the way it is. And so I'd like to think about your question, James. What is good education now? How do we actually get there?
We look forward to having all of you that have been with us this evening back with us for the next webinar in a month's time. We will send out notifications. We hope that you will all be able to join us again as we will explore the topic of what is good education now in the next webinar. Thanks once again to my guests, our guests this evening, and to Colin and Charlene behind the scenes who've been helping to keep everything going for us. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again in a month's time. So from TIMCA, for the moment, it's goodbye from us. Thank you so much, Ian and Sipho, once again.